and we're very grateful to have Ambassador Chenoy here. You have full details of his biography. I mean, it's extraordinary how many languages he speaks, how many countries he served in for the government of India as a diplomat at the highest levels, including some of the key issues, including the border dispute, etc., with China. So it's great to have him. I'm very conscious in this town that when we have such a distinguished guest, every institution gets a piece of him or her. And Ambassador Chenoy has already spoken at, I think, at least 5-6 places. 10 places. So
different languages in each place.
Probably different topics. I know I've gotten reports from various friends at various meetings about how much they benefited from listening to Ambassador Chenoy. So we're very grateful to you, sir, for coming. And he heads now the Institute for Defense Studies and Analyses, where I had the good fortune to participate in a conference a couple months ago, their annual Asia Studies Conference, Asia Security Conference. And we're going to hear from him today on, he's spoken on Indo-Pacific, he's spoken on various facets of India, but this is the first in a series of a couple upcoming programs on India. This one will deal with economic transformation involving foreign policy. But when we get to Q&A, of course, he can cover just about everything. So we will, he'll speak for whatever, 20, 30 minutes, whatever he needs, and then we'll go until 1:30 for Q&A. Ambassador, welcome and thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Lemaire, for this opportunity to come to the East-West Center in Washington. This is a great opportunity and chance to meet a number of new people, because I've run through 10 events and I've probably met half of Washington by now. And thank you for referring to me with terms such as distinguished. In my own assessment, I have gone quite recently from being a distinguished ambassador to being an extinguished one. But it's a great opportunity to come here as the Director General of the Institute for Defense Studies and Analyses, and to try and share with you my perspective on India's economic transformation and its evolving foreign policy. And I'd like to use as a point of inflection the fact that in order to understand India, one needs to understand India in its civilizational terms, in historical terms. And you all know that India is an ancient land. It is the world's 7th largest country with 1.2 billion people. We will soon become the most populous country in the world in another 10 years or so. And a full 1/2 of the population, that is 600 million people, are actually below the age of 25. So therefore, India is also a very youthful country. And it's a land which has existed for long, stirred the imagination for thousands of years of travelers who came to India for different reasons. It is a land that has always been pluralistic and assimilating in character. For even when conquerors came to India thousands of years ago, they were very quickly absorbed into the Indian fold and introduced to the Indian way of life and identity. India is a land which gave rise to the earliest concepts of peace and non-violence, as seen in the values advocated by ancient religions like Jainism, Buddhism, which spread from India to East Asia. We had Christianity take root in India 2000 years ago as a result of St. Thomas the Apostle being there around 48 AD, as early as that. We had Judaism in India with a history of 1900 years. For the Jewish people came as refugees to India after the fall of the Second Temple, and they have existed there as a community intact with their own way of life even today. So it's a land which has multiple faiths, multiple peoples, and yet we celebrate our unity in diversity. It's our plurality that we actually celebrate as being Indian. We have never ever aggressed against another country or another people. And from the time of Buddha, to the time of Mahatma Gandhi, India has always advocated the principles of peace and non-violence, of peaceful coexistence, of acceptance, of tolerance, and a kind of fraternal brotherhood in society. And this has served us well through the ages, helped us to retain our identity, our cultures, even as the vicissitudes of history took one direction or the other. And it is an India that found itself under colonial rule as well in the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries, all the way to the middle of the 20th century, but finally found its own sort of equilibrium and place under the sun as an independent nation in 1947. And since then, the Constitution of India, which gives us equality, equal rights, and non-discrimination at all levels, it has served us well. Democracy is not just an article of faith in the Indian Constitution, but it is also a way of life in India. It is a tradition that has existed for thousands of years. Over the last 70 years or so, India has done well in terms of making several achievements in areas ranging from industry to space to atomic energy to science and technology, agriculture. But the economy did remain constrained for want of integration with the global system. And it is after 1991 when we opened ourselves up to liberalization, we began to become part of the global systems. The change that is evident in the economy in India is astounding today, more so as a result of the policies of the past few years. The change has been unprecedented in terms of what we are witnessing today. As a result of far-reaching socio-economic reforms put in place over the last 4 or 5 years, we have seen India emerging as the fastest growing large economy in the world today. In nominal terms, it is already the 6th largest economy, and in terms of purchasing power parity, it is the 3rd largest economy in the world today. By the reckoning of Goldman Sachs of 2003, it is estimated that of all the BRIC countries, and now BRICS since 2009, that is Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, it is India that is the best placed advantageously to achieve very high rates of growth, around 6% or more, consistently all the way till the middle of this century. And notably on account of the fact that we have the demographic dividend in India, where we have around 12 million young people, able-bodied youth coming on stream in the labor market. And this is something that is available to India at a time when the rest of the world is experiencing, including in Asia, the phenomenon of aging. And we see that in Japan, most noticeably, but we also see it now increasingly in China, where the initial advantage of having a very large population has been lost over the last 3 decades, after having, of course, achieved a great deal of growth, unbridled growth in China at about 9.5%, even double-digit growth rates over 3 decades. But we find that the economy in China has begun to slow down as a result of shortages of labor, as a result of inability to chase the labor arbitrage advantage, costs going up. Growth elsewhere in Asia, in Japan, has perked up a little bit to 1.6%, but not quite the 9% growth rates that Japan has experienced in its first 30 years after the war, that is to say roughly from 1949 to 1979. Be that as it may, the fact remains that global economic engines have shifted to what is now called the Indo-Pacific, earlier called the Asia-Pacific, over the past 3 decades, we've first seen the rise of China as a very large economy, today the world's second largest economy. But it's also equally true that the rest of Asia is also growing quite rapidly. So Asia, which is home to about 60% of the global population, is today growing in many parts of Asia. Other than China, we have seen rapid economic growth beginning with the Philippines to Indonesia, and now in South Asia, India having emerged as the fastest growing large economy in the world. Now, India has a focus on maintaining a peaceful periphery, on ensuring that it can devote itself to the primary task of economic growth and development, inclusive growth at that, which will ensure that every last man, woman and child in India is enabled to benefit from prosperity and also become an integral part of the mainstream socio-economic changes and developments in India. To that end, India's foreign policy is geared to a neighborhood first policy, for we must secure peace on our borders. Efforts have been made to reach out to the neighbors to have better relations. First and foremost, we have a tremendous concern with regard to terrorism, which rises consistently from that great epicenter, that great global crucible of terrorism known as Pakistan, which is straight on our borders. We've been dealing with this spectre of terrorism for a very long time, and it is a debilitating factor, for it diverts attention from the priorities of economic growth and development. With the People's Republic of China, which is our largest neighbor, we have a very large quantum of trade. We have a fairly deep economic partnership, which is primarily predicated on trade, largely in favor of China, I should say excessively in favor of China. So there is an adverse balance of trade there, which we are trying to fix by ensuring that they buy more from India. We also have an unresolved boundary question with China, but the focus has also been on maintenance of peace and tranquility in the India-China border areas, which over the decades has been achieved overall in a satisfactory manner. It could be better. We have to continue to make efforts to ensure that we have peace and tranquility on our borders with all our neighbors. We have concerns with regard to China's presence and activities in South Asia, and noticeably in the broader maritime region of the Indian Ocean. In the Gulf, we have extensive ties with most Gulf nations who are energy providers to India. The largest of them are Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and others that have been providing a great deal of our energy requirements as our economy grows. We have about 8 million people there, remitting about $35 to $40 billion annually from that part of the world to India. And we have excellent, in recent years, excellent coordination and cooperation with the Gulf countries on security matters, on intelligence sharing, and on issues such as terrorism. We have other concerns in the Indian Ocean region, such as concerns with regard to foreign forces setting up bases of the east coast of Africa. Piracy, for instance, is another cause of concern. We would like the island countries there to develop and progress rapidly, accessing finance that is available without strings attached. We promote, therefore, the developmental model that respects transparency and openness, which respects the environment, which is economically viable, fiscally responsible, and which also respects sovereignty and territorial integrity. There are, as you all know, parallel models today available in this part of the world, some which cause great concern and may lead to dependencies of the type that can be easily avoided. We have very important ties to the ASEAN region, which is the interlocking region between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. We have civilizational ties there, but more relevantly, growing economic and cultural ties that are contemporary. We have a very robust partnership with Japan under the rubric of our special strategic and global partnership, which has come of age. It is a relationship of great trust, of great convergence, of firm faith in being fellow democracies, of having shared values, of having links that go back into the distant past in terms of Buddhism. The fact that there was an Indian monk called Bodhisena who was present at the consecration of the great Buddha in Nara way back in 752 speaks for the kind of historical links that we have between India and Japan. The Japanese language is replete with Sanskrit words like seva, for instance, which means service in Sanskrit, also means the same thing in Japanese. The hiragana katakana script is also linked to the Sanskrit alphabet. And many Hindu gods and goddesses that are part of the Japanese pantheon as well, quite distinct from Buddhism. Some of you may have heard of the three of the seven lucky gods in Japan being of a shared nature, like Saraswati as in Benzaiten, or Shiva as in Daikokuten, or Kubera as in I forget the Japanese name of Kubera now, but there is Ganesha as in Shoten, there is Lakshmi as in Kichijoten. So you can see that there's an array of things on which we have commonality. More relevantly, today Japan is an integral part of every big infrastructure project in India. India is the largest ODA partner for Japan. Japan is the largest cumulative investor in India. If you discount the fact that Mauritius and Singapore are platforms for third country investments, it's Japan at the top, even bigger than the United States. And iconic projects like the Shinkansen bullet train, the Delhi Metro, the Delhi-Mumbai freight corridor, industrial corridor, and the dedicated freight corridor, all these are coming up across the country from Japan as it seeks to diversify its portfolio. As growth slows in China, there are many that are looking to other pastures, so to speak, and India offers a scalable alternative that is second to none. And Japanese investments have been slowly flowing in larger numbers towards India. India is increasingly being seen as a very large and dynamic potential manufacturing hub for the rest of the world, for supply chains that may be relocating in the region for whatever reason. India is also being seen as central to the capacity to market out of India, not only to Africa, but also to Europe. Cars manufactured in India are also being shipped as far away as to Mexico. Japanese companies make cars in India and ship them back to Japan, for we offer the advantage of democracy, a very large domestic market, and above all, as I said before, the demographic dividend of a youthful and plentiful labor force. So in that context, we have a number of flagship programs in India on the economic front, such as the Make in India program, which you all heard about, but there is also Smart Cities on the anvil. We have a startup hub program, as in Startup India. We have a skills development program known as Skill India. So there are prolific changes taking place in the Indian economy, and it is our consistent effort to see how we can integrate other larger economies with experience, with investment and capital and technology to spare, to come and take root in the Indian economy. It's a win-win situation that would also help for a more prosperous region overall. We also have robust relations with the United States of America in terms of our foreign policy. we have what is known as the Global Strategic Partnership. The US is by far one of our most important partners, and today more relevant than ever in view of the fact that the global and the regional situation is in a state of flux and there's great uncertainty. We no longer have the luxury of peace and stability of the type offered earlier by the Cold War, nor by that brief period interregnum of the 90s when we had a unipolar world. But post 2001, with China's entry into the WTO, you have China as the world's second largest economy. And in Asia now we've also seen there are growing tensions, not only on account of trade, but also on account of the geostrategic and geopolitical changes that are underway in our part of the world. There is this all-important concept of the Indo-Pacific, which is being increasingly spoken about. And in that context, let me briefly say that India's concerns obviously stem from its geographic location. First and foremost, India has security, national security and defense concerns with regard to continental threats, for we are basically a very large continental power in South Asia, and we have nuclear powers on our border, we have unsettled boundaries, we have terrorism, as I explained to you earlier. So that's the first mandala, as I would call it in Buddhist terms. In the second mandala of concern is the vast openness of the Indian Ocean, both stretches of waters, the Western Indian Ocean and the Eastern Indian Ocean. And as I told you a while earlier, there are broader concerns there with regard to protecting sea lanes of communication, protecting energy pipelines across the seas. A great deal of our trade, 90%, goes through these waters. A great deal of our energy comes through these waters. And we then have broader concerns in the region of the South China Sea, which is the interlocking body. As India is integrated with the global community, we have markets that we service across these waters into the Pacific, to Japan, Korea, all the way to the United States. So the South China Sea, the principles of freedom of unimpeded commerce, of navigation, of overflight, of uncrossed, these are all very important to India. And then the last mandala is that of the Pacific, where we increasingly have stakes. We have been participating in exercises such as RIMPAC. We have the Forum for India Pacific Islands Cooperation, known as FIPIC. We have very close ties with countries like Fiji, for instance, where there's a very large diaspora. As you know, there are 32 million people of Indian origin all over the world, nearly 3.5 million of whom are well placed and actively contributing to progress and development in your great country here, the United States of America. So this is the mandalas in which India looks at the region. We today are embedded in a foreign policy that is consistent. There are many features of Indian foreign policy that remain the same over the ages, no matter which government is in power, largely to do with maintaining peace and tranquility and focusing on economic development. Ties with the United States, there is broad consensus in India that these ties must always be robust. We were estranged democracies for long, and as I have said before, that if fate conspired to keep us apart, it is destiny that is bringing us even closer together. So we must grasp the nettle and make the most of this partnership as the 21st century unfolds. Relations, as I said, with Japan are of extraordinary importance. With Australia, we have very good and close ties. We exercise with them. We don't just play cricket with them. And it's not just that they eat the curry or that we are both part of the Commonwealth, but that we also have great trade relations with Australia. We participate in their multilateral exercises such as the Kakadu or Pitch Black, the naval and the air exercises that they conduct every year. and we have a very broad understanding and convergence, as we have with the United States and others like-minded countries, on the evolving architecture in the Indo-Pacific region. Why there must be agreed to principles, as the Prime Minister of India said in Shangri-La on the 1st of July 2018, that our outlook for the Indo-Pacific is that it should be one which is open, transparent and inclusive. It should be one in which there are rules of the road. It should be one in which there is equal access to the great commons, to natural resources, one in which we emphasize the importance of connectivity and infrastructure, and also one in which we ensure that the model for development is one that is based on respect for the environment and on economically viable, fiscally responsible principles. That we must also ensure at the same time that we may have differences in this vast space known as the Indo-Pacific, different civilizations, different cultures, but we must never allow differences to become disputes, and we must never allow contestation or competition to become conflict. And that's the kind of broad sense we have of our foreign policy. I don't know if I should stop here, for if I ramble along, I will simply use up the rest of your time. I have spoken for, as promised, for exactly 30 minutes. And I could stop now so that you have a chance to relate to what I have just said, perhaps reflect on it, and we can take this further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, as always, Ambassador. It's so amazing to hear how eloquent you are without notes, no flipping through a text, etc. And you've covered an enormous range of India's interests and interactions. So just remember, today is on the record, and we are live streaming the program for those who couldn't join us in person. So with that in mind, I'll open it up to the floor. I'm sure there are questions. If not, I have some. Yeah, Bella, why don't you please introduce yourself and then make a comment or question to the ambassador.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Bella Chan. I'm a visiting scholar here at East West Center. And thank you, Ambassador, for your talk. So, as you mentioned that India, has become very important now, and then people keep talking about the Indo-Pacific concept. So I wonder whether India has its own vision for the Indo-Pacific region, and then as the Quad dialogue with the US, Japan, Australia, and India, now re-emerge. So I wonder because they focused on the democratic values and free and freedom. So I wonder whether the partnership between India and Vietnam, where does it fit, in that picture? Yeah, thank you.
I must tell you, I visited your country quite recently, about 2 months ago. I had a wonderful visit. I went back after 20 years.
Oh, wow.
Exactly. I went again to Halong Bay. It's only become more beautiful. And I really like Vietnam, the Vietnamese people. The food is great there. But above all, we have a tremendous partnership between India and Vietnam, as you're probably aware.
Yes.
So we consider Vietnam to be one of our closest friends there. And there's a great groundswell of goodwill and support for all that we stand for, as in our values are greatly appreciated in Vietnam. Now, as for the Indo-Pacific and the Quad, let me simply state that these are not to be conflated. The Indo-Pacific and the Quad are different concepts. They may be related, as are most things in these terms. But let me firstly posit what we mean by the Indo-Pacific, because it's easy to use a term, but one must know how we arrived there. Now, my theory is that Asia, I speak personally, these are my views, Asia is essentially a colonial term that we have been using for a few centuries when the British ruled the waves east of the Suez all the way to Shanghai. And so that's a geographic construct that crept into the lexicon as a result of the colonials moving into Asia, using island development strategies for trade, using the mare librum and mare clausum theories to contest the slocks even then on the high seas. Many things are not new actually. What we see today have been practiced by the ancients in the past as well. And so that's Asia. After the Great War, when Britain became a diminished power and the United States of America became the reigning hegemon and I'm not using a pejorative term here, simply to state as a matter of fact the dominant power, that this region came to be more broadly referred to as the Asia-Pacific. That's partly because of the Pacific War, the fact that you had a Japan that was incarnated from the ashes of the war and began trading with the United States. Other big economies sprang up. South Korea, you had the Asian Tigers, and more recently, in the last 35 years, the People's Republic of China. So that space was broadly referred to for a very long time as the Asia-Pacific. You are also to be reminded that the Asia-Pacific did not normally include South Asia or India. It was always the oriental part of Asia that was broadly referred to as Asia-Pacific. And the change that has come about now is a recognition of the fact that Asia is growing in many parts, and in South Asia, India has also emerged as the fastest growing economy. Beyond that, there are geopolitical, geostrategic aspects of developments in these water bodies, whether the Pacific or the Indian Ocean or the interlocking body of the waters of South China Sea, that have led to the newer definition, the broader definition of the Indo-Pacific that stretches all the way from the Pacific Islands, if you please, all the way to the east coast of Africa. So that's the broad definition of the Indo-Pacific. As for the vision, I did mention to you what India has said at the Shangri-La Dialogue. That remains our vision. But the key point here is that this is a vast region with many civilizations, with many histories, with a great record on economic development, but not such a stellar record when it comes to security architecture. There remain in place disputes and differences, and like the Holy Grail, a common overarching security architecture remains elusive. There isn't much of a consensus, even in the sub-regions, on how to handle differences. So therefore, the larger question that arises is that how do you build the Indo-Pacific? Now, you will have to consider interlocking mechanisms between the sub-regions. You will have to consider the principles on which the Indo-Pacific will be predicated. And one of the stronger principles is, of course, openness, transparency, and democracy, rule of law, shared values. So these are things on which the Indo-Pacific structure can emerge as a new overarching architecture that provides for better peace and stability in the 21st century. As for the Quad, briefly, there are 4 countries in the Quad. There are 3, that is the United States, Australia and Japan. There's primarily maritime concerns, though of course the United States is in a league of its own with interests that are also terrestrial. But largely 3 developed countries and 1 developing country, that's India. 3 that have broadly better focus on maritime issues. 1, as I said before, that has primary concerns in its first mandala, that is continental in nature. We've got to understand this before we get to what you want the Quad to do in the 21st century. So therefore, we should keep all this in mind and use the building block approach to see how we can take this forward and build a broader consensus, whether in the context of the Quad, which is one among many of the plurilateral structures for dialogue that exist all over the world. But this is of special significance because it is rooted in a somewhat difficult part of the world today, one that is in ferment, which is seeing new tensions emerge. So I will leave it at that.
We have, all of a sudden, several, let me go around the room, starting here. So we have 15 minutes, so I'm just conscious both
You
of
can
the
add another
questions.
5 if you want.
Yes, sure.
We started late.
Please.
Thank you, Raghuveer Goyal. I'm a journalist in Washington covering the White House and State Department. Thank you so much, and it's a very timely that you have come, Ambassador. My quick question is that no doubt that I believe that Prime Minister Modi will be back, his government will be back second term. But there have been many issues during the election years with the US, like tariff and trade, and also not to buy the Iranian oil, and also with Pakistan, of course, and with China, so many, and Russia, US-Russia arms deals, and among others. So when Prime Minister Modi comes back second term, what do we expect as far as US and India relations, or India and neighboring relations are concerned? Because he will be a new Prime Minister in a new broad thinking, not in the past, but the moving forward the relations or India in the 21st century. Thanks, sir.
Thank you. I can only speak for India. I cannot speak for the ballot box. So the point I would like to make is that India's basic policies, as I said before, are expected to continue. And the good work that has been done in the recent past will speak for itself in terms of enabling India to stride forward and make greater progress in the future. As for our bilateral issues between India and the United States, for instance, we have trade issues under GSP, for instance, or IPR issues under 301. We have to evolve the right kind of dialogue mechanisms in order to address them, and take things forward. This is a world in which there is a great deal of give and take. A certain amount of vision is always required when we are working with friendly countries, with partners, if not with alliance partners, with friendly countries, with close strategic partners. So it calls for a kind of robust, realistic assessment of where we want to take the relationship forward, and then we take in our stride the various bumps that are inevitable in any partnership. So I don't see that as a great challenge. This is inevitable. When there are differences over trade, we have to sit down and talk about them. The trade negotiators will do their job eventually. So it's not as insurmountable a problem as is made out. In the broader context of the strategic partnership, I think it's only a little, blip there.
Mr. Ambassador, just quickly, make in India or made in America, any problem?
Right.
Prime Minister Modi is saying make in India. President Trump is saying made in America.
I think that's the basic principle of all trade, because throughout history, it has been nobody's contention that only one country will make everything. If you see the history and the genesis of trade, it's all about who makes what better, and then you exchange these goods. So nobody really need make everything. You need to make what you can make best at the most competitive rates, and leave the rest to others who can make things better than you. So I'm sure the United States can succeed in its Make in America policy, and we can equally, without any kind of contradiction, succeed in our Make in India policy as well. There'll be enough room there for everyone to make. But you make what you make best, you don't make things that you can't make best, because that defeats the logic of the fundamentals of trade.
Thanks, sir.
Michael?
Yeah, Mike Anderson, retired Foreign Service officer. Very comprehensive overview of India. But you didn't mention two things. Let me raise them and see if you have any reaction to them. One is SARC. Is SARC alive and well, or dead, or irrelevant? And then two is higher education. You mentioned the Indian economy has opened up to liberalization and the global system. But it strikes me, I'm not an expert, but it strikes me that the Indian university system has not changed and is holding India back. Would you comment on those 2 points, SARC and higher education?
So as far as SARC is concerned, we attach importance to our neighborhood first policy. One of the guiding principles of India's foreign policy is that we want to see growth and prosperity for all in the region, not just India, and we would be very happy to see that our neighbors also prosper as much as we do. There can be a mutual benefit accruing to all of us as a result of that process. We've seen some very good growth rates recently in Bangladesh. We have seen Bangladesh performing very well in certain sectors like textiles, for instance. So I'm sure there is scope for others to do that same thing. The fly in the ointment, if I may call it that, is that within SAARC, within South Asia, we have a kind of problem of a negative kind of veto on certain things. For instance, in 2014, when the government of Prime Minister Modi had come to power, he had invited all the South Asian countries at the level of their leaders to participate in the ceremony, the oath-taking ceremony. As he assumed office, shortly thereafter, there was a proposal for a SAARC satellite, if you are aware, which would have been beneficial to the entire region. But all but one agreed to participate. We have that motor transport agreement in South Asia, but sometimes there's,
Bhutan has it decided.
some kind of indecisiveness or lack of a final decision on such things. And above all, we have this problem of terrorism emanating from one specific part. We also have a situation where India has extended trade benefits and advantages, zero tariffs, etc., to most of the neighbors. We had extended these favorable terms of trade even to Pakistan. But the whole point I'm making is that these are not always reciprocated in the same way. So leaving that aside, I think the important point is to see that within the region, which is acquiring a broader definition, as you know, more recently, the broader definition includes Afghanistan, for instance, in South Asia. So we have to see how we can work together with the subsets of this region as well. If we can work together better with Bangladesh and Myanmar, we will have a go at that. If we think we can work better with Afghanistan, even if it takes an air corridor in terms of connectivity, or it takes a maritime corridor to build that kind of connectivity, we will have a shot at that. As for higher education in India, generally speaking, we have always attached great importance to education. As you are aware, it's also an Asian phenomenon, more so in countries like India. There is deep regard in India, of course, for the higher education that you offer in the United States of America. But in the last few years, I'll simply draw your attention to the fact that a very large number of new institutions have been set up, such as several new Indian institutes of management have been added. It's not just the old 3 or 4 that exist now, so maybe another 8 or 10 have been added. Similarly, the Indian Institutes of Technology. A simple effort at Googling will tell you how many new IITs have been added. Many of these are in tandem with countries like the United States, which was part of setting up the first of the IITs, or Japan that has set up the IIT in Hyderabad, for instance. So higher education is being given great importance. In recent years, a very large number of IIMs, IITs, universities, colleges have been set up. We have a large population. There is emphasis on education, especially of the girl child, and that I think is an extremely important step taken by the government of India to ensure that the girl child, who is ultimately the ultimate teacher in society, in a family, as mother, also she is the first teacher of all humankind. So there is great importance attached to that, to primary education, emphasis on the girl child's education and welfare, and higher education as well.
Steve, you were next.
Steve Winters, independent consultant. I'm so glad that we have you here with your expertise and tremendous background. So I read that Xi Jinping will be in New Delhi this summer at some point to meet with the president there, and I'm sure he'll have a lot of things on his agenda. But I wanted to ask you how you evaluate this proposal for a new economic corridor that they're calling BCIM, so Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar corridor, which would be a long railway going from Kunming over to West Bengal. And I gather this is rather controversial, but as following up from the previous question, it would seem it might open tremendous possibilities for prosperity. And also, the point is sometimes made that at least looking at the other northern side of India, the western side, you're sort of bottled in there, and it's difficult to get a connectivity into the center of the continent from that direction. So, what's your thoughts on this proposal?
Yeah, firstly, it's important that the summits at the apex level take place. So we have summitry between India and China. Last year we had the Wuhan informal summit, as you know, the first time that India and China engaged at the informal level, at the level of the Prime Minister on our side and President Xi Jinping on their side, in an informal summit in which there's no prior agenda and there's no deep desire to simply work on fine language of summit documents and things like that. So that's a very useful process which provides strategic guidance to both sides. This is necessary when there are sort of thorny issues in bilateral ties, or simply even to promote any kind of cooperation and engagement. And so it is inevitable that the next round will take place in the near future, and President Xi Jinping is expected to visit India for the second round of the Wuhan summit. Dates, of course, would be worked out through diplomatic channels, as all practitioners know. The point here is that the BCIM is not a new proposal at connectivity. It's at least 20 years old. It was originally known loosely by a term coined in the late 90s known as the Kunming Initiative. And so I remember visiting Kunming in the late 90s. I remember being there in China, in Beijing, with President K.R. Narayanan in May 2000, when he met President Jiang Zemin, and the Kunming Initiative was discussed. It was part of the talking points. So that's not new, connectivity. But it's not all about railways. There's a great deal more. It's about road infrastructure. It's about trade between the border peoples there. It's about looking for some kind of convergence in markets between Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar. Now, it's also something that has been around, as you know, heretofore as part of the so-called Belt and Road Initiative, but India is not part of the Belt and Road Initiative. You are aware of our principled position there. Our concerns, of course, are primarily related to the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is the flagship program under the Belt and Road Initiative, and which we have rejected completely as being illegal because it passes through disputed territory that we rightfully claim as our own. That is to say, Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. And we do believe that broader consultations should and ought to be held in advance when such sensitive matters are concerned, etc. But that does not erode from the fact that there is great scope to work on connectivity in the region. India attaches great importance to connectivity, especially on its eastern flank. We have what is called the Act East policy. With Japan, we have the Act East Forum, which is primarily directed to in the first stage, developing infrastructure and connectivity in the northeast part of India, and thence to further to Myanmar and to Thailand. We have the proposed trilateral highway between India, Myanmar and Thailand as well. We have the multimodal transport hub called the Kaladan project over there, which has both landwards and seawards links to Myanmar. So connectivity is something that we attach great importance to, whether we do it under the rubric of the BCIM or whether we do it bilaterally or trilaterally. It's all beneficial to the region.
I'm sorry, but the last question to you, Miss, and then we'll have to close up, please.
Yes, Trent, AU. India foreign policy.
American University, yes?
Yes.
Are you yes.
India foreign policy, maritime security, South China Sea. Post-China claim of this 9-dash line, Vietnam is compelled to arm itself in uncharted waters. Has India provided maritime training? Could you elaborate of the type of training that would assist the Vietnamese, but at the same time meet India's strategic security interests?
Well, I cannot go into the details of defense cooperation between India and Vietnam, but suffice it to say that we have a robust defense partnership as well with Vietnam. And this is a bilateral choice that any two sovereign countries can make. So it is not necessary to link this to others and third parties. We are sovereign countries. We are at liberty to have whatever relations we want with Vietnam, and conversely, Vietnam can also have robust relations with India. We do have active defense cooperation with them. We do have some training programs. We do have some transfer of equipment, but that's normal. India does not have a very large defense export industry, but of the type that we do export, yes, Vietnam is one of our destinations as a very friendly country, as one of our strategic partners. So, yeah, there are fish to fry in the Indian Ocean, in the South China Sea. Yes, there's fish everywhere.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Well, Ambassador, thank you so much. This is, as always, so interesting to hear the range of issues that India is grappling with. In the US, as we were discussing before the session, we're in the process of thinking through our India relationship. It's extraordinary how far the relationship has traveled since Michael served there some years ago, and when I first started working on the relationship, it's made significant strides. And in the context of this very rapidly changing Indo-Pacific region, I suspect there's a lot more work to do together. So it's terrific to have your views. I would just note that before we formally thank the ambassador for his remarks and for his presence, I just note that we have one more program on India coming up on May 20th, a little earlier at noon, and that's Dr. Ranajoy Sen, who is actually working out of Singapore. And so he's been working on the elections. And as you know, the Indian elections have been going on in April and May, and we're on the verge of the announcement of the outcomes, etc. But he will be here just before those are formally, officially announced. So it'll be a good time to take a stock of early readings, the data set, potential coalition politics. The second program that I flagged on the next day, May 21st, Tuesday, is on the U.S.-Philippine alliance between, we talked a lot, Bella has been working on the U.S.-Vietnam strategic partnership, but this is on the U.S.-Philippine alliance, so we'll be looking at Mr. Amador. And then on the 29th, a colleague from the Ministry of Defense, Deputy Minister of Defense of Malaysia, Miss Ivy Kwek, who's been working on the first ever Malaysia Defense White Paper, will be coming here to discuss what we might look at in the upcoming Malaysia White Paper. So those are some programs. With that, let me join, would you please join me and viewers on our site to say thank you to Ambassador. You have to do yourself.